On September 28, 1987, a woman named Maria Gabriela could no longer ignore the reasons behind her illness and the other people around her. She was the first to notice and associate the illness with a glowing substance that was being recovered from a machine laying around at an abandoned building. With an employee of her husband's junkyard named Geraldo, she gathered the substance and headed towards the nearby hospital named Vigilancia Sanitaria. Geraldo was carrying the materials in a bag slung over his shoulder while heading towards the hospital. Later on, an intense burn would reveal in that area. Soon, more people in Goiânia began turning up at hospitals with bruises and burn marks. The doctors were baffled by their mysterious injuries. Little did they know, a strange disaster was unfolding in their city, all because of two thieves were trying to extract some valuable metals. Over the next few days, the full extent of the disaster would be revealed, as the truth about a radioactive substance called cesium-137 came into light. The substance had been mishandled by the thieves, and it had spread throughout the city, causing serious illness and even death. This is the full story of a rather strange nuclear disaster ever happened in Latin America. A nuclear contamination accident happened in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia is the capital and the largest city of Brazilian state named Goiás. It sits on the central Brazilian plateau, a region known for its cereal farms and cattle ranches. In 1971, a cancer treatment center local to Goiânia bought a radiotherapy machine, a device that focuses beams of high-energy emanating particles from a highly radioactive source material into tumors, in this case cesium-137. When the practice finally closed 14 years later, most of the clinic was subsequently demolished and the machine was abandoned, left in a derelict state. This was already a disaster in potential, as the radioactive heart of the machine was now an orphan source. A self-contained radioactive source, no longer under proper regulatory control, was lost, stolen, or otherwise unaccounted for, and that made it extremely dangerous, as the entire city would soon find out. In the fall of 1987 in Goiânia, scrapper Roberto dos Santos Alves decided that he could no longer ignore the rumors he had been hearing about some valuable materials being left in the abandoned clinic of IGR. On September 13th, Roberto dos Santos, with his friend Wagner Pereira, descended on the site of the abandoned building with some simple tools and discovered what they thought of something valuable. After some poking and prying, they managed to break free the capsule. However, what Roberto and Wagner didn't know about this capsule was that it was the heart of a radiotherapy machine used for cancer treatment in the hospital. To understand what happened after, it is necessary to distinguish the major components of the therapy unit. The sealed radioactive source capsule that Roberto and Wagner managed to break free was set in a source wheel made out of lead and stainless steel. It forms a rotatory shutter mechanism. To produce a radiation beam, the shutter was rotated electrically to align the source capsule with the radiation aperture, from which the radiation will target the cancer cells and damage their DNA. This in turn kills the cancer cells or slows their growth by damaging the DNA. Cancer cells whose DNA is damaged beyond repair stop dividing or die. When the damaged cells die, they are broken down and removed by the body. After exposure or in the event of a power failure, a spring-loaded device returned the shutter with the radioactive source to it to the off or safe position. Between the rotating shutter and its electric drive mechanism, there was a cylindrical shielding plug. These elements are collectively referred to as the rotating assembly. The unit was designed so that the rotating assembly could be removed with special tools from the shielding of the radiation head. The radioactive source was cesium-137 in the form of highly soluble cesium chloride salt. This had been compacted to form a coherent mass which was doubly sealed within two stainless steel capsules. Cesium-137 is a radioactive material used in medical devices and gauges. With a half-life of around 30 years, it is produced as a byproduct of the fission process performed in nuclear reactors and nuclear weapon tests. It's a soft, flexible, silvery white metal that becomes liquid near room temperature, but can easily bond with chlorides to create a crystalline powder and is easy to handle. However, this specific powder form is highly soluble in water and could lead to a widespread disaster if not handled properly. The amount of cesium powder used in IGR's radiotherapy machine was around 93 grams, stored in a capsule no larger than a thermos, which was left out in the open. It was a ticking time bomb, ready to spread radiations and affect thousands of people around the city. And unfortunately, the demon was unleashed unknowingly by Roberto and his friend. On 13 September, after extracting the metal capsule from the facility, which they thought might have some scrap value, they put it in a wheelbarrow and drove back to Roberto's home. The two men, after coming back, tried to break open the capsule but failed. However, on the same day, they managed to break down the outer iridium window. They started vomiting shortly after, but assumed that was due to something they have eaten. The next day, 14th of September, Wagner started feeling dizzy and also had diarrhea. His one hand was swollen and appeared to be burned, consistent with the beam aperture of the rotating assembly. On September 15th, Pereira visited a local clinic, where his symptoms were diagnosed as the result of something he had eaten. He was told to return home and rest. Alves, however, continued with his efforts to dismantle the equipment. By 18 September, Roberto placed the rotating assembly under a mango tree in his garden. In course of the attempt to remove the source wheel of the rotating assembly, he managed to puncture a 1 mm thick window of the source capsule. With the help of a screwdriver, he scooped up some of the glowing substance. He attempted to light it up. He then succeeded in removing the source wheel. In the evening, the pieces of rotating assembly were sold to the Dwyer Ferreira, a nearby scrapyard owner. He lived next to the junkyard he managed. That night, he noticed a blue glow was emanating from the pieces placed in the garage. Intrigued by the glow, he thought that the powder must be valuable, like a gemstone, or maybe even supernatural. But what he didn't know is that the blue glow wasn't something magical, but a phenomenon named Cherenkov radiation. Simply put, it's a form of energy that we can perceive as a blue glow emitted by the electrically charged particles that compose atoms, like electrons and protons, when they move at high speeds faster than that of light in a specific medium. And here, the charged particles emitted by the radioactive material cesium-137. I'll provide the link to the blog where you can learn more about the Cherenkov radiation in the description. Now back to the video. Dwyer took the capsule into his house. Over the next 3 days, he invited various neighbors and relatives to see the capsule and its glow as a curiosity. During this time, Dwyer and his wife Maria Gabriela examined the powder closely. A friend of Dwyer named Ernesto Fabiano visited him and was amazed by the glowing substance. With the help of a screwdriver, Ernesto was able to remove several fragments about the size of rice grains, easily crumbling into powder from the capsule. He took some of the crystals to make a ring for his wife. Dwyer also distributed some of the fragments to his family. There were several instances where some people daubed the radioactive powder on their skin, like the glitters used in carnivals. The next 2 days, Maria got sick. She had diarrhea and was vomiting profusely. She visited the nearby São Lucas hospital and her diagnosis was the same as of Wagner, an allergic reaction of something she had eaten. She came back to rest and called her mother to come over to nurse her. Her mother stayed there for 2 days and returned, taking a significant amount of contamination with her. By now, Wagner was admitted to Santa Maria Hospital, where he stayed until 27 September. The skin effect of the radiation exposure was diagnosed as the symptom of some disease and was transferred to the Tropical Disease Hospital. The pieces of radioactive assembly were also handled by 2 of Dwyer's junkyard employees, Edmilson and Israel Batista, primarily extracting the lead. On 24 September, Dwyer's brother Ivo showed up and scraped out some of the dust out from the source, spreading a part of it on the floor of his house. His 6-year-old daughter Leje later ate while sitting on that floor, absorbing some of the radioactive material. She was also fascinated by the blue glow of the powder, applied it to her body, and showed it off to her mother. On 25th September, the buyer sold the lead and the remaining source assembly to the owner of another junkyard. One of the employees at Junkyard 2 and another person went back to old IGR clinic and removed the remainder of the shielding container, weighing about 300 kilograms, and took it back to the junkyard. By now, a significant number of people were getting sick and showing up at the hospital, vomiting and having diarrhea. At this point, Maria was convinced that the glowing powder from the source assembly was causing all the sickness. She, with an employee of the voyage named Geraldo, went back to the junkyard and had him put all the remnant they can find of the source assembly in a bag, sling it at the back of Geraldo's shoulder, took a bus and placed it on the doctor's desk at Vigilancia Sanitaria. The doctor left the bag on his desk but removed it to a courtyard and put it on a chair as he was worried that the remnant in the bag might be dangerous. Maria and the employee Geraldo were then sent to a health center, but later they were transferred to a tropical diseases hospital. Within a few hours, several people who had been contaminated started showing up at the same hospital. However, one of the doctors had begun to suspect that the patient's skin lesions does not look like they were due to some tropical disease. It looked like they were formed as a result of radiation damage. He contacted yet another doctor who was working at the Tropical Disease Center, only to discover that he wasn't the first doctor who had called him about suspicious symptoms. It was then decided that a medical physicist would come here and inspect the bag Maria had just bought, but he wouldn't be able to do so for at least another day. The next morning, he showed up with a scintillometer which he borrowed from a local government agency. Being normally used for geological measurements, the highly sensible detector had a fast response time and the dynamic range of 0.02 to 30 micrograys. Grays are the unit of measuring the amount of radiation received by human body per kilogram. For reference, one chest X-ray delivers around 0.1 milligrays of radiation, a 10 days worth of radiation you would absorb from the environment. Therefore, 1 gray of radiation would be equivalent to almost 10,000 chest X-rays, more than 100 years of background radiations at once. The physicist arrived at the center and decided to switch the meter on before he entered the building. The meter immediately indicated the highest value it could measure. No matter what direction he pointed it, the radiation levels were off the chart. Thinking there is something wrong with the meter, he returned back to the local government agency and got a replacement within 2 hours. However, the new meter also displayed the highest amount of radioactivity from the moment he switched it on at the health center. The physicist was now convinced that there was a major source of radiation inside the health center. At the same time, the doctor who saw Maria Gabriela called the fire department. The firefighters were planning on picking up the bag and throwing it in the nearest river, but the physicist was able to convince them not to go near the source. Soon, the police and fire brigade evacuated people and prevented others from re-entering the building. The doctor explained where the source had come from, and he with the physicist went to the wire's junkyard. There they found the same off-the-charts reading on the meter. Over the next few hours, government agencies were contacted and Ferreira and his family were evacuated from the house. The health secretary was informed and the National Nuclear Energy Commission was brought up to speed by the nightfall. The health secretary had made the city's Olympic Stadium a staging ground for receiving potentially contaminated persons, and the Tropical Disease Hospital, the first to see many of the suspicious symptoms, was informed that their patients were now irradiated. Known sites of contaminations were resurveyed and the Civil Defense Force was put on alert. Emergency responders struggled to contain the contamination and provide medical care to the victims. The Estadio Olímpico Pedro Ludovico has a capacity of 13,500 people beginning on September 30. The National Nuclear Energy Commission would monitor over 112,000 people there on the field. Those who most affected by the radiation were placed in tents and more people throughout the city were showing up. After hearing the rumors, many tried to go to the Olympic Stadium simply to reassure. The authorities' improvised strategy worked effectively in bringing the situation under control and preventing further serious exposures. Contaminated persons were directed to take showers and place their clothes in bags. This reduced the ticking of radiation meters between 50 to 80%. And monitoring equipments were set to screen hundreds of lining up outside the stadium. However, These measures were not 100% successful. The victims who affected were constantly sweating cesium-137, and they accumulated in their bodies in the early morning hours of September 30. Within a few hours, the remainder of the source bought by Maria was contained by authorities. Using a small crane, a sewer pipe was lowered over the chair where the bag was still sat, and concrete was pumped over. The radiation rates dropped significantly. Out of 112,000 people monitored for cesium-137 exposure in Goiânia, around 1,000 have received the equivalent of an entire year's worth of normal background radiation in just a few days. 249 were seriously contaminated, either externally or internally through direct contact with cesium dust, and out of those, 20 had got acute radiation sickness. These patients were transferred to hospitals across Brazil. Ernesto Fabiano, who took a rice grain-sized chunk of cesium to make a ring for his wife, ended up putting that piece in his pocket against his thigh. The radiation ate through his largest muscles. The bus driver, Odesson Ferreira, lost most of the skin on his hand where he handled the powder and would end up losing the tips of his fingers. The rupture of medical device in Goiânia resulted in the worst case of cesium-137 contamination in medical history. A history that includes both Fukushima Daiichi and Chernobyl, and sadly not all the tragically curious 20 would survive. Leger, the 6-year-old daughter of Ivo, who thought she was playing with some fairy dust while eating her lunch, died. She succumbed to acute radiation poisoning. Her impending burial news caused a riot of nearly 2,000 people. They believed that her body would poison the land. Stones and bricks were used to block the car carrying her body. Nonetheless, she was successfully buried in a special fiberglass coffin lined with lead. Similar things happened with Israel Batista, one of the scrapyard employees who dismantled the cesium capsule for its lead. Edmilson de Souza, aged 18, worked with Dos Santos and also died. Maria Gabriela, the woman who disclosed the whole incident, the aunt of Leger and wife of Devair Ferreira, died on the same day as her niece 1 month after the exposure. The Goiânia accident would end up costing 4 lives, the contamination of an entire city, and an economic catastrophe, all from less material than would fill half of a tennis ball. The only good thing that we can say about the accident is that the situation was brought under control by the swift action of both public and private personnel. All sources of exposure were identified and contained by the following Saturday. The main concerns now were the patient treatments and the cleanup of contaminated sites. A helicopter with mounted detectors surveyed an area of around 67 square kilometers. In the same way, cars also drove around the city, covering more than 2,000 kilometers. Around 85 houses were significantly contaminated. 42 of them were decontaminated with vacuums and pressure washers. The rest, along with several city blocks, were demolished. 3 buses, 14 cars, and around 50,000 toilet paper rolls were also now radioactive. In total, 3,500 cubic meters of waste was sealed away around 1.5 Olympic swimming pools of cesium-poisoned material. By Christmas, all the main sites of contamination were dealt with, and work continued with the hopes of returning the area to normal. But while the dust can be buried and homes can be rebuilt, the terror just a handful of glowing powder caused that would not go away from the minds of the people of Goiânia for the rest of their lives. The Weir's family lost everything. Their homes had been destroyed, irradiated pets had to be put down, and the whole family's history were packed into drums of nuclear waste and buried. The junkyard owner Devair Ferreira died after 7 years after his wife Maria, reportedly due to years of heavy drinking and depression. Despite high levels of exposure, the 2 thieves, Wagner and Roberto, survived. However, Wagner lost a finger on his left hand and the others disfigured. Roberto lost his entire right forearm. The mango tree under which he managed to puncture the capsule gave a dose rate of 1.1 grays. The entire house has to be demolished and the topsoil was removed. The bus driver, Odesson Ferreira, also lost parts of his fingers and skin on his hands. However, the damage done wasn't just physical, to which Odesson recalls being ostracized by his community. They tried to block his family from moving into certain neighborhoods. He ended up getting vasectomy because he was now too afraid to have any more children. Odessin told, quote, "I still have pains in my hands, especially when the temperature changes. Sometimes my hands are so hot that I have to put them in the freezer." End quote. Today, Odessin is the president of the Association of Cesium Victims in Goiânia, which has more than 1,600 people seeking continued compensation and medical treatment. The original radiotherapy capsule was then recovered by the military and is now on display at the School of Specialized Instructions in Rio de Janeiro and is much less fatally attractive. The estimated cost of this accident was $300 million, and the aftermath was still being felt years later as some of the victims continued to suffer from the effects of radiation exposure. Cesium-137 is a radioactive isotope that is harmful to humans if ingested or inhaled. In Goiânia accident, many people were exposed to cesium-137 dust and they suffered from severe symptoms such as vomiting, diarrhea, and skin burns. 4 people ultimately died as a result of the accident. This was a tragic reminder of the potential dangers of nuclear energy, and it highlighted the importance of strict safety measures and the responsible handling of radioactive materials. But it was also a cautionary tale about the risk of human curiosity and the need to think carefully before acting. The thieves who took cesium-137 in Goiânia had no idea of the dangers they were exposing themselves and others to, and their actions had devastating consequences. This accident serves as a reminder of the need to be vigilant about safety and to always consider the potential risks of our actions. It also underscores the importance of properly disposing the hazardous materials and ensuring that they are stored in a secure location. Today, Brazil has strict regulations in place to prevent accidents like the one in Goiânia from happening ever again. I hope you guys now have a better understanding of the events leading up to this accident, the impact it had, and the lessons we humans can learn from it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with others too on social media. Also, if you have any suggestion for me like how I can improve the content or any topic or event you want me to make a video on, please mention them in the comment section below and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll be back soon with a new video. Thank you.